So firstly, salam alaikum. Thank you all very much for having me here tonight. And I hope this talk will this talk will introduce the topic of mental health and well-being. We are going to show a short film called Open Secrets, but before that, I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about the work of Mind in Harrow, and also about, what is mental health and why it's important. So just to firstly explain a little bit about Mind in Harrow, you might have heard of us. We're a local organisation based in College Road. We are affiliated to National Mind. National Mind has been in the press quite a lot recently in terms of the importance of raising awareness about mental health, and also the kind of mental health crisis that we're experiencing at the moment in the UK. So we provide support to those experiencing really emotional distress in Harrow. Over the course of a year, we see about 3,000 people from across all different communities in Harrow who are experiencing some kind of distress. And we basically provide a variety of different support services. So we provide a lot of social support to people, because what we find is that people who are going through these kinds of experiences are often very isolated, and therefore social support can play a huge part in terms of supporting them in their recovery. We also do a lot of campaigning around issues such as the changes in welfare benefits, particularly for people who are experiencing mental health problems. Often physical health issues are seen as a disability, but mental health issues are often not seen in quite the same way. So we try and raise awareness about the impact of mental ill health on people's ability to kind of function and to get into employment. I've provided some more information at the back about our services, so do feel free to pick them up. Okay. So basically what I wanted to talk a little bit about today is, what is mental health and why does it matter? And particularly really around the stigma that we see. And so when I say stigma, I mean the fact that people are often very ashamed of mental ill health and struggle to talk about it within their own communities and talk about it with family and friends. So the film that I'm going to show to you today, want to move. Okay. The film that I want to show to you today is called Open Secrets. So just to give you a little bit of background to this, back in 2011, we worked with a campaign called Time to Change. Time to Change is an anti-stigma campaign. And really the aim of the campaign, again, was to really tackle the stigma around mental health. It had some quite kind of well-known figures involved in the campaign who you've probably seen through the media, Ruby Wax, Stephen Fry, to name just two celebrities. That was the aim of the campaign. And in Harrow, we did a culturally kind of specific campaign targeting the South Asian community. And part of that work, we showed Open Secrets at the View Cinema in Harrow, because Open Secrets was directed by Azim Khan. It's really based around a kind of the impact of stigma on someone who's experiencing bipolar disorder, and it's from his own point of view, and it is autobiographical. So he himself had his own experience of bipolar, and so it has a very sort of personal touch to the film. I would say that the film is quite powerful. It's only 17 minutes long, so just to be aware of that. But yeah, I hope it raises some kind of important issues which we can discuss afterwards. Okay. So I hope that film was enlightening and highlighted some issues, some of which you may be familiar with, some of which might be new to you. I was just wondering, is there any comments that you have, any reflections? Yeah.
What was the starting about when he slit his wrist?
What was
the beginning about when he slit his wrist?
So that is part of, when people suffer from manic depression, often what happens when people are in a very low mood is that it can lead to self-harm. And for a lot of people, that is becomes a way of expressing emotional pain. So when people can't find another way, often they do end up self-harming. It's quite a common problem amongst lots of young people, amongst lots of different age groups, communities. And it's actually something that's particularly experienced in the South Asian community. There's a particularly high rate of self-harm, often down to the stigma, because the stigma prevents people sometimes from finding that other vehicle of expression. Anything else?
It doesn't explain what the mental health issues are.
Okay, so yeah, I'm going to go on to that. Okay, so if we talk about sort of mental health, and this is quite distinct from what mental health issues are. Obviously, I've only got 40 minutes, so this is a very, very quick sort of overview, and is also very much how it's seen within, I guess, the NHS and sort of Western psychiatry. There are different models and understandings of mental health across different cultures, and I think it's really important to say that. So I'm just giving one perspective here. But in terms of sort of how it's understood here, the World Health Organization says that if you're in good mental health, you can make the most of your potential, cope with life, play a full part in your family, workplace, community, and among friends. So that's how the World Health Organization defines mental health. Now, as you can probably realize from that, most people therefore don't have mental health the whole time. Our mental health fluctuates. There are times when we perhaps struggle to play a part in our community, where we struggle to engage with family and friends, depending on what's going on in our lives and how we're feeling. So our mental health therefore fluctuates, it changes. And so yeah, in Western psychiatry, mental ill health therefore refers to a kind of quite a wide range of conditions. Bipolar is one of them, and there are other diagnoses like depression and schizophrenia, which was mentioned in the film. And just to give you an idea in terms of what the diagnoses mean. So in terms of diagnoses, in the kind of Western psychiatric system, diagnoses refer to a kind of a combination, a kind of cluster of symptoms, and really refer to how people think, how people feel, and how people behave. And so when people's feelings, when people's thoughts, and when people's behaviors are assessed as being identified within a particular cluster of symptoms, that's when a diagnosis is given. The diagnosis is given within a particular time frame. So obviously we all have days when we're feeling not in a particularly good mood or in a low mood. But if that persists over a sort of long period of time, and if there might be a reason for it, but equally there might be no reason for it, then that is when a diagnosis like depression will be considered. It's also important to say that people's social context and their political context is also taken into consideration. So, if you went to your GP, or if you went to and you were then referred to a psychiatrist, the context in which what was going on in your life at that particular time would also be taken into consideration. So a lot of the reasons, particularly that we see in terms of diagnoses like depression and anxiety, are a result of people perhaps going through relationship breakdowns, going through very stressful times at work. It can be a whole host of factors that therefore result in people, experiencing these kinds of issues. So just to give you a kind of idea, in terms of depression, depression is generally understood in terms of these kinds of feelings and thoughts and behaviours. So when people feel kind of low in mood, when they feel quite restless and agitated, when they feel tearful, they can feel quite numb, quite empty. Often they can also experience real isolation. They can struggle to engage with friends, with family. They can find no pleasure in the things that they used to enjoy doing. And sometimes people say that they experience a kind of sense of unreality. So obviously we all at times perhaps have one of these kind of symptoms, but it's when it's a kind of cluster of those symptoms that then in the Western kind of psychiatric model, that would be understood as depression. Does anyone have any questions about that?
So the Eastern model of depression is different?
No, depression is actually something that's kind of generally understood to exist across all cultures, but how it's expressed is often understood, has been shown to be different across cultures. So, for instance, in China, they often talk about the same kinds of feelings, but in different ways. They talk about it as in terms of aching heart. And again, it will be expressed in maybe a slightly different way. So it might be expressed in terms of dizziness or in terms of a sort of light peppery feeling. So that's where the kind of cultural nuances come into mental health. And that's why I think often it can be very difficult for people from different communities to often access and kind of sometimes receive the appropriate treatment within the kind of Western model of psychiatry. Often we find that people don't necessarily relate to these kinds of symptoms. They often express it in very different ways, which is why actually I think dialogue with communities is so important so that we understand how different communities express distress and also how they cope with them, because we can learn a lot from that. Yeah? Okay, so why does all this matter? Well, it really matters. In terms of however it is expressed, we know that emotional distress, stress at work, anxiety, has a huge part to play in terms of the kind of disease burden that exists in the United Kingdom. So we know that mental ill health accounts for 22.8% of people going off sick or becoming ill. It's much more than cancer. It's much more than cardiovascular disease. So this is, again, according to the World Health Organization. So looking at studies that have been done and doing that kind of research, this is what has come out. So just to highlight some of the kind of key issues that I think were raised in the film, and that, at Mind and Harrow, we're really trying to kind of bring to the kind of forefront of communities' attention. So the first one is the stigma, and this kind of sense of not wanting to talk, of it being a really kind of taboo topic. And the kind of impact that can have on people. I mean, you saw in the film, the kind of difference in that young man's kind of look on his face when he knew that he had his family to support him, when it kind of became a much more open topic within his family. So there, this can have it can really exacerbate people's experiences of mental ill health when they feel that they aren't able to talk about it, that they have to hide it. And again, that's been kind of proved in studies that have been done by the Mental Health Foundation, that stigma has a massive impact. Kind of moving on from that, I think there's a kind of perception sometimes that, and it was kind of expressed in the film around it being that man's fault, it's your fault, that you're going through these kinds of issues. And I think the thing to say is that often the people, certainly the people that we see through our doors, they often experience these conditions as a result, as I say, of their kind of social context, so of relationship breakdown, of childhood trauma, of things that have been going on in their lives. So, in that sense, it's very much contextualized. There's not so much evidence, or there's mixed evidence around the kind of biological aspects of mental health. There's quite a lot of debates going on as to, how much is it down to the bio, the social, and the psychological aspects of things. There's, as you've seen in the film, there's a kind of real issue of it being seen as a weakness. The need to kind of portray this kind of strength, and often as a man, and often that can prevent people from kind of talking about the kind of emotional side of their lives. And again, that's when, people don't talk, and the problem can be exacerbated. There's a lot there around, being a success, and we've seen a lot around, young people having a lot of pressure put on them, to achieve, to become lawyers, to become accountants. And, whilst those are really good aspirations and it can be really positive, we know that they can also put a lot of pressure on young people, and it can, again, result in, huge amounts of stress, anxiety, and ultimately depression, particularly if then they feel that they haven't succeeded and met those expectations. So just to touch a little bit more on some of these kind of cultural aspects that we, have been proven to be true via lots and lots of research. So in terms of susceptibility to mental ill health, migration can have a huge, huge impact. So the experience of migration, coming from one country to another, not necessarily feeling accepted by the host community, experiencing discrimination, racism, all these issues can become very interconnected with mental ill health. And not that there's a direct link, but that it can make people more susceptible. Interestingly enough, there has been studies to show, and this is quite interesting again in terms of going back to that presentation of illness, that in the West, when people experience psychosis and delusions, those delusions are actually more linked to sort of electrical things or kind of technology, whereas those that experience delusions in the East often relate it more to kind of spiritual aspects, and it often has a kind of more religious basis. A kind of another key issue that we see, and particularly when people present at GPs and even to our services, is that we have a lot of people who talk about back pain or stomach pain or chest pain. And often what we find is that there's actually, sometimes there is no actual physical problem. It can be a resistance or an expression of emotional pain. So emotional pain will be expressed through physical pain, and that's what we call somatization. And so this is it's just something to be aware of, and it's certainly something that I think is being seen quite a lot. Finally, one of the kind of, I think, food and nutrition, and again, this is a kind of whole nother talk in itself. But one of the things that we really try and encourage is around, just keeping a check on vitamin levels, on, having a balanced diet. Low vitamin B12 can induce symptoms which are very similar to mental ill health. to the diagnoses that I talked about, particularly depression and psychosis. So it's really worth making sure, if you are starting to experience some of those symptoms, that you have those vitamin checks. You're making sure that you're intaking kind of vital vitamins, nutrients through natural means. Okay, one issue that through my conversations, and particularly in the Muslim community at the moment, that we've seen and we're aware of is the impact of Islamophobia. And I think I wanted to mention it because I think it's something that has been very much linked to people's, it's been talked about in terms of, the police being involved in physical safety, but the impact in terms of mental health is only really just starting to be addressed. There was recently an article in the Huffington Post about this issue, talking about how, we need to see mental health as not just a kind of personal problem, but also part of a kind of greater social and political context. So yes, there was a 2012 study which revealed how Islamophobia negatively affects the mental health of Muslims worldwide, and it can increase feelings of anxiety and of depression. And people don't have to face that discrimination directly. It can even be the kind of feeling of perceived threat that can then have a resultant impact. So on that note, I wanted to kind of share with you that actually towards the end of March, on the 20th of March, Mind and Harrow are linking up with the Muslim Doctors Association, and we're doing an event addressing this issue at Harrow Mosque, which you'd all be very welcome to attend, and particularly talking, having that dialogue around the impact of Islamophobia on mental health and issues around depression and anxiety that can relate to that can result from that. So there's some information about that at the back of the room, so please do feel free to take that. Okay, so these are sort of nothing new, nothing sort of radical, but I think it's always worth kind of reiterating these things because, we all can forget. So, obviously in terms of, good mental health and in terms of keeping well, staying connected with friends, with family, with your community. We know that kind of your faith communities and spiritual lives have a huge part to play in terms of mental well-being and supporting people's mental health. Giving time to yourself. We're in a very manic world where lots of stuff is going on, constantly bombarded with information. So that me time is really important. Sleep, a lack of sleep has also been shown to induce, historically it's been used as a form of torture, but it's known to induce kind of symptoms of mental ill health. As I said before, kind of a balanced diet and making sure that, you've had your vitamins and you're taking in the right nutrients. Exercise. So they recommend 30 minutes of exercise 4 to 5 times a week. I find that pretty hard, but even just some kind of fresh air and, making sure that you get out and about, it releases, what's known as kind of happy hormones. So all these things are kind of really basic, but really worth keeping in mind. So I just put down some kind of, in terms of getting support and where to get support, because often people don't know. So obviously we're a local service, and as I said, there's some information at the back about, the kinds of services that we provide, and we're open to all communities. I've also put a list of some kind of key contacts, including organisations like the Muslim Youth Helpline and the Muslim Community Network. So there are lots of kind of, I guess, faith-specific, culturally specific organisations out there. Some of you may not know, but recently there have been changes within the kind of NHS and in terms of the way that people should access services. So mental health services have changed a bit in terms of how you access them. So we now have one point of access. It's called the single point of access. So you can call up as an individual, or if you're concerned about a family member, there's one number. And I've put it down there, and if you're interested, it is also at the back. And obviously, you can always go to your GP, go to a community member or a family member, and have that conversation. I guess our main message is always don't suffer in silence. We are a charity and we get funded. We get funded by different grant-making trusts. And so it's always really helpful to have your feedback in terms of, what we could do better, how we could better engage, what you've learnt. So I have put some forms at the back. So and there are some pens there as well. So if you have time, I'd be really, really grateful if you could fill those in. Are there any other questions?
I just wanted to ask, do you have a ratio of men to female sufferers?
So no, not. I mean, for some conditions, there maybe is a slight difference, but generally, no. It's actually quite difficult to tell, partly because what is known is that men find it a lot more difficult to seek help. So in terms of that emotional suppression or repression, men often do that more. So they often don't seek help as much as women. So that makes it really hard to know, therefore, exactly what the distinctions are. But there are some things like self-harm, which I think is more associated with women than with men. Suicide is higher amongst men than amongst women. So there are sort of slight variations, but it's hard to tell. Yeah.
Hi. So firstly, thanks for coming. I think it was really great, really hard topic to tackle. So I'm one of a few GPs in the audience.
Okay.
Just to kind of, there's nothing that you said is wrong. I think it's all brilliant, very well accurate. I think it's really interesting, like the problems you've highlighted. I think just wanted to get your views, really. So personally, I work in Brent, and I think Brent has suffered a lot from the changes in mental health, and mind has actually stepped up tremendously to cover what has been lost by the NHS. I'm not sure many people know that. The big problem that I think we face, this is the faith community, so all different backgrounds, but I think generally the biggest problem is the language barrier with therapists.
Okay.
And I know that's difficult because there are so many different languages and more new languages. So where I work now, I can't count the percentage of the population that speaks Portuguese, because they're all coming from Brazil. The area is full of Brazilians. But I think particularly with South Asian languages, particularly with the elder generation, having therapists that could speak Hindi, Gujarati, Urdu is incredibly important. And shortage, I don't know what you think about that and what Mind, especially in Harrow, offers, because I think that's so valuable, even at a trust level, where the trust between the two people involved, the patient and the therapist.
I completely agree. It's a massive problem, and we see it a lot, particularly in terms of where information is translated. Often a lot of the meaning can be lost in the translation. And I think the kind of nature of the diagnostic system makes that problem even greater. So words like depression we know are not easily translatable into, and there may be no word for them in other languages. So yeah, I'm completely with you. In terms of what we do at Mind and Harrow, so we have a very diverse workforce. We do kind of particular work with particular communities because kind of recognising actually those issues. So we've done work with the kind of Tamil community because there's a lot of trauma experience there. We do work with the South Asian community. We have a group called ECTA, which means Unity in Gujarati. And that is a kind of peer support group, which has over 100 members. We've done work, we've just coming to the end of a 3-year program funded by Comic Relief with the Afghan community, which is coordinated by a lady who speaks both Pashto and Dari. So yeah, that's basically what we've done and the kind of model, I guess, that we've adopted to kind of address some of those barriers. But I don't think it goes far enough. Yeah.
Yes, I'd like to thank you as well. I thought it was a very important presentation. There was 2 mental illnesses mentioned in the video, schizophrenia and bipolar. I just wondered if you could mention some other common ones.
Okay, so other common mental health problems are depression, which I also mentioned, anxiety disorders. So there's a kind of almost like a host of diagnoses that come under the broad spectrum of anxiety. So one of them is obsessive compulsive disorder, which is actually extremely common. So yeah, that's when anxiety, quite extreme anxiety, can trigger kind of obsessive rituals in order to try and minimize that anxiety. And quite intrusive thoughts. People can experience very intrusive thoughts as a result of those high levels of anxiety. I mean, it's almost like a day's. Why I didn't go into it too much is because it is almost like a whole nother. You can do a whole day on depression or a whole day on schizophrenia. They are quite complex, and particularly schizophrenia is quite contested as well as a diagnosis. So, there's been a lot of stuff that's happened recently. There was a kind of commission for schizophrenia looking at it as a diagnosis across different cultures. So yeah, they're quite complex things to talk about in such a short space of time.
Thank you. Also, just following on from that, the video mentioned about like at Stigma that you say you have to pull yourself together and this sort of attitude to mental illness. So how would you counter that? People that say mental illness is just about people not being disciplined or pulling themselves together. So what would your reaction to that be? What would your response be?
So my response is one around compassion, and also an understanding that actually that often isn't the case. As I said, for most people, periods of depression, periods of even things like bipolar disorder can be triggered by lots of different things, people's social context, but also things like childhood trauma. What happens to people between certain ages can really, really impact on their susceptibility to certain diagnoses. So, that, I guess it's kind of, for me, it's about education. But I also think, communities have a really, really important role to play in all this. I think, we as an organisation can only do so much, but we must have dialogues with communities, and we must have try and have these kind of open conversations, because, otherwise the language is going to remain quite alienating. And that stigma ultimately will persist. So it's really encouraging, communities in whatever way they feel comfortable to kind of speak out and start that dialogue.
Can I ask quickly? So, what do you think is the main reason for the increase in the prevalence of mental health diseases? Do you think it's more just recognition, or do you think there are other factors that are playing a bigger role?
So I think the kind of social and political context and times that we're living in are quite frightening. We're seeing more. I mean, I don't think people realise how many services we've seen go in the last year or two. I mean, services are going at the rate of knots, basically, due to all the cuts that are happening. So, and with that, with people not getting the support that they need, we are going to see, an increase or a more noticeable increase in terms of accessing crisis care, so accessing psychiatric support within the NHS. I think that there is a kind of debate to be had about the kind of, the role of drug companies. And, I think that is quite a contested issue in terms of the role of medication and in terms of how, there is obviously big money behind pharmaceutical companies. So there is an argument, I guess, to be said that, that could be pushing an increased diagnosis. But I think we're living in frightening times, and I think there's a lot of pressure on young people, unemployment, all those issues that we hear of all the time are contributing to this crisis.
Is there any specific work going on to push the government to withhold these social cuts? Because, I mean, as was announced today, Sir George Osborne, for example, is coming forward with more cuts now. Is there anything that is being done or that can help with in terms of that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that, I don't know if any of you know about the Bridge Day Centre in Harrow, but that's a service that has provided support through Rethink Mental Illness to many, many people over the years, and that's on the brink of closure. There's been a petition going round to try and prevent that from happening. And I know that there have been numerous consultations with the council involving, GPs and involving other healthcare professionals. So, I think if communities speak up and sign these petitions and, get behind these causes, then ultimately that puts pressure on decision makers to change their decision making.
Any more questions?
So how does one access the service? Is it through referral?
Yeah, so you can access, as I mentioned, about single point of access. So that is a sort of one point of access to access adult mental health care services. So you can call up as an individual, or as a family member if you're concerned about someone, and you can have a totally confidential conversation about your concerns. This is quite a new thing, the single point of access. It used to be that you had to go through your GP, then through community mental health teams, and people got very lost in the system. So that single point of access is a new thing to try and streamline things. In terms of Mind in Harrow and kind of other voluntary sector organisations, you can call up. You can have, again, you actually don't have to disclose who you are if you just wanted to have a kind of confidential conversation. So there are organisations out there where where you can access support.
And those people who provide help at this single point of access, are they medically qualified or?
Yeah, so they are doctors. I think, they're doctors. I think they're social workers. So they're all kind of allied healthcare professionals, and they've been trained in terms of, understanding the issues that people are presenting with.
In your experience, are there any particular group of ethnic communities where you think there's not sufficient support mechanism or structure within that community that you think other communities can perhaps extend their hands?
To be honest, I think the figures show that certainly amongst a lot of minority ethnic communities, there isn't the same access rate in terms of services. So they're not accessing services at the same, rate, and with the same kind of, I guess it's sometimes to do with confidence and then going back to stigma. And that, I don't think within that, I don't think there's one particular community. Yeah.
Any last questions?
Post-traumatic stress, particularly those who have come from war-torn areas. Don't you think, at least my experience is that the general health professional community, including GPs, lack the expertise and understanding of this condition, which really needs to be explored. And I think it is rampant amongst majority of these groups who have fled as refugees or as migrants.
Agreed. I completely agree with you. I mean, it's something that we see a lot of. When we started working with the Tamil community, which, as I'm sure many of you know, have experienced significant trauma. The trauma was so palpable, and combined, with the kind of language barriers that we've been speaking about, the difficulty in terms of expressing and also understanding the impact of that trauma. I mean, trauma can affect, as I'm sure you know, people in so many different ways in terms of memory, in terms of, their kind of bodily functions. So, there's a lot of education and awareness raising that needs to be done. And again, there are less and less services that are supporting people appropriately. I mean, there are a couple that are still around, but that kind of counselling in community languages with a deep understanding of the impacts of trauma is very hard to come by.
Thank you very much. I think we'll end there.
Okay, thank you.